where they need to be so that we don't have to rebuild houses. Now, that brings up another topic, and that is, how would we relate to this if it were a matter of rebuilding the houses, as we now have to do in Japan? Well, likewise, to refinance all, Japan, as many people may not know, it suffers twice the amount of federal debt, that is the debt of the federal government, per capita, that we do here in the United States. So there's a tremendous benefit to adopting mathematically perfected economy, which counts all prior payments of interest instead toward principal, resolves most of the debt already. Imagine, for instance, you've just had your house destroyed in Japan. Well, let's just say it would cost several $100,000 to to just pay off the remaining principal in it, and because of an inflated price, and yet there's not as much material in this single wall construction as there might be in the United States, for instance. They're more frugal with materials. Yet that house could be rebuilt for less than that, and yet as a result of this disaster, there's a huge untenable sum of debt relative to each dwelling. We're not even talking about industry, stores, shops, which have been destroyed. Well, by counting all prior payments of interest toward principal, most of the prior debt would likely be resolved. A further matter is that we would, in this transition to mathematically perfected economy, we would downwardly adjust the original principal as well to a ceiling which of whatever the true cost, that is the cost of the labor of producing the house, would reflect in the price that we would rightly pay for the house today, if the price were not financed far above that by a purported banking system which takes all the excess as unearned profit and deprives the people of just reward for their own production. So by downwardly revising the ceiling on what would be financed to a reasonable cost, which is equivalent to barter. Remember, I say that mathematically perfected economy is the monetary equivalent of barter. By downwardly adjusting this ceiling as well, we minimize the costs to Japan. So, for instance, let's just use Katrina in the United States as an example of a prior experience from which we can reflect upon. And let's just say that a person might have had what's been sold to them as a $500,000 house that they're paying thousands of dollars a month on, and that's been destroyed by a hurricane. And now we rebuild the house, but to a ceiling of what it actually costs to build the house. And let's just say that's a fraction of that, maybe $200,000. Well, under mathematically perfected economy, the payments might be $150 or $200 a month for that house, the brand new house that replaces the old. And being as the old was partially consumed, let's just say the payments against it might have been half that, you see. So for perhaps $250 a month, which is a tiny fraction, perhaps 10% of what's being paid for the original house that was destroyed, a person could pay off their prior house, which was destroyed, and buy a brand new one to replace it under mathematically perfected economy for a fraction of those costs, simply because of the eradication of the unearned profit of banking. So, sure, the United States could maybe send $50 billion to Japan to help it rebuild itself. But in truth, a far greater service would be simply to support Japan in adopting mathematically perfected economy. This would have affected Japan as it would any other country in many further ways. Why were these nuclear reactors built, for instance? And why were shortcuts, obvious shortcuts, compromises of good design followed instead of what would have prevented some of the problems that we're seeing here, such as storing fuel, the so-called spent fuel. It's depleted fuel. It's not spent. They keep calling it spent fuel in the news. It is not spent fuel. It is partially depleted fuel. It's only marginally depleted fuel, in fact. Why was this stored in the same places, vastly complicating the situation which occurs? Well, the truth is, nuclear power produces permanent pollutants, contaminants of the earth, which, in my opinion, no responsible person would ever pass on to further generations. So I have a huge problem with nuclear power. In fact, when I was young, I had journeyman cards in 5 different trades as a welder, one of which was a journeyman steam fitter, and I worked on the kind of pipes that provide superheated steam to turbines such as are created by these nuclear power plants. And although I was regularly offered work at nuclear power plants even when I was young, I refused any of that work because my hands were not going to contribute to the creation of facilities which produced a waste which could contaminate the world for virtually forever. So those things are unnecessary. Other forms of power are available today. The stories behind the scenes imply that, in fact, government, which serves the ruling elite always, is actually restraining these developments as opposed to supporting them. Which developments of green energy implementations stand to benefit mankind immensely and totally eliminate the need for nuclear power generation. In my opinion, my long-standing opinion, these things are unconscionable. So the fact of the matter then is that only under mathematically perfected economy can we in fact afford to make the best decisions that we can make. And when it's all considered, being as this mandate, for instance, for mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation, compel a government which provides such a thing as nuclear power as a part of a power infrastructure, electronic power, that is. When a government does that, it has to account for all expenses, and this would include reasonable disposal costs and building costs, which would be responsible for all of the possible points of failure and complications of complications when any complication arises. The truth of the matter is, nuclear power is probably far more expensive in many ways than we have so far entertained. And this is the lesson of the moment. And that lesson is not to be lost upon all of the downplaying of it, which is unfolding before our very eyes and ears in the news media of the world. I'm hearing of terrible things that the Japanese people are suffering. We all have, in every part of the world, to stand up against these things so that the Japanese need to be served by the Japanese people's own government is not befuddled by the possibility that events can be confused and obfuscated into some misrepresentation that nuclear power can be made safe, that other alternatives should be denied to us so that the nuclear power industry can prevail in reaping great profit at such consequences as are evident. So it's the responsibility of everyone, because a true free world doesn't exist. Representation doesn't exist unless we all are unwilling to tolerate any downplaying of the truth. What cost is worth risking, even risking, the jeopardization of the huge areas of Japan and every other country of the world that has nuclear reactors? Not to mention what washes out into the sea and so on and so forth. What cost justifies the risk of contaminating potentially so much, even of a prosperous, deserving country such as Japan? You know, no risk justifies this. And so I believe that it's incumbent upon anyone who proposes such a thing as nuclear power to rightfully be responsible for all of its consequences. And so if this nuclear power industry, so-called, is unwilling to protect the people from possible all people from possible consequences of these things, which of course we all understand is something that is unfeasible. It can't be done. And so you never propose something like this, you know. So we all have to stand up against this together, because other forms of energy, which have no risk whatsoever, are readily available today. And it's the same people who are advocating nuclear power who are preventing us from having those things. So, and I'm not meaning to imply just the nuclear power industry itself there. I'm talking about, you know, the financial entities in the world which have quote unquote invested in all these things and are intending to get what they consider to be their rightful return. They are committed to this path, which is so dangerous and impermissible to all of us. So let's stand against all these things, and this is why we have to do it. And this same mandate for mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation is the tool to do so. Now, there's one other thing that I hope to cover in today's program, and this was a dissection, so to speak, of Max Kaiser did a recent interview of one of my most blatant plagiarists, Ellen Hodgson Brown, who's advocating spending money into circulation, whereas just 2 years ago she was arguing against me in the op-ed forums, for instance, that interest wasn't even the problem. Now, of course, my work is responsible. It stood as the original landmark in arguments which have now been widely accepted across, the various monetary reform efforts to invalidate any claim to interest. We don't truly borrow money from banks. All the banks are doing is publishing evidence of our promissory obligations to each other.